Hi, I'm gonna talk about the short story The Boogeyman by Stephen King. And the way I'm gonna structure this is that first I'm gonna do a short introduction to the short story, then I'm gonna do a summary, then I'm gonna talk about the protagonist and his problem and what this could mean and how you could interpret it. Then I'm gonna talk about the Boogeyman as a metaphor, and then about other horror stories with this similar themes as in The Boogeyman. But the short story The Boogeyman was written by author Stephen King in 1973. It was first published in the March 1973 issue of the magazine Cavalier, and it is about a man called Lester Billings, and he's from Waterbury, Connecticut. And in the short story, he tells his psychiatrist, Dr. Harper, of a creature known as the Boogeyman. And he tells his therapist about how the Boogeyman has killed his three children called Denny, Shirl, and Andy. And he has kind of come to Dr. Harper as he feels responsible for the deaths. And Billings remembers two things, or two significant details about each of the deaths. Because before all of them, the child screamed the word Boogeyman and refused to sleep alone that night. And after all the deaths have occurred, or after each of the deaths, a closet door had been slightly opened. And the first child, Danny, apparently died of crib death when Lester and his wife Rita were in their early 20s. Then their second child, Shirl, died, and Lester and Rita then moved house after they gave birth to their third child, Andy. Rita's mother then gets ill, and Rita has to leave the family to go take care of her mother, which leaves Lester and Andy alone. And the Boogeyman has made its way to the family's new home, and one night Lester even catches a glimpse of the Boogeyman before he kills Andy too. But as Lester finishes his therapy session and goes to the lobby to make a new appointment with the secretary is nowhere to be found. So he then returns to the doctor's office, where he finds the Boogeyman with a mask in his hand, resembling his doctor's face. But the story of the Boogeyman kind of starts in medias res with there is no introduction as to who Lester is and why he needs therapy before the story really begins. It simply just starts with the words, quote, "I came to you because I want to tell my story," unquote. So he tells his so-called story in flashbacks, where he mentions the three cases of death that has occurred. But there is kind of a common theme in the story as to whenever Lester Billings is stressed out or he is feeling unsure in his life or unhappy, one of the children dies. So at one point he mentions that the only job he could get was, it says, quote, "The only job I could get was loading Pepsi Cola trucks in a warehouse, and I was tired all the time." So he's constantly stressed when the two first children die. But then in the period between Shirl and Andy's deaths, Lester was quite happy with his life and living with his wife and son. Then when Rita's mom falls ill, his stress returns and another baby dies. And it is possible that the Boogeyman is a part of Lester Billings' own personality and a part that surfaces whenever Billings gets stressed or unhappy. So in that sense, you can say that the Boogeyman is sort of a personification of Lester's mental health. So yeah, whenever Lester is happy, the Boogeyman is gone, and he reappears when he gets stressed. And Freud kind of has a term that you can use on this called the it, as it is Lester's subconscious need to get his desires fulfilled, and he doesn't really know the differences between right and wrong when he becomes the Boogeyman. And the part about desires could be that maybe he doesn't really want the children, and perhaps he doesn't really feel like children is really fits into his idea of what the perfect life is right now. But then again, by contacting a psychiatrist, Lester's superego steps in and decides to take action to stop the killings and to not be this evil person anymore. So the Boogeyman, yeah, is this personification of the it, kind of like the child in him that doesn't know right from wrong. But also inside of Dr. Harper's closet was a tan raincoat. It says on the first page, it says, inside a tan raincoat hung on one of 4 or 5 hangers. Beneath that was a pair of shiny galoshes. The New York Times had been carefully tucked into one of them, that was all. And as we know from one of the first lines, Lester has lived in New York. He was employed by an industrial firm. So all these things with the galoshes and the raincoat kind of fits him as a raincoat you use that when it's raining in New York, and it often does. In the New York Times, you read that when you're at work. But the funny thing is that it was a tan raincoat, almost like skin colored, as if the boogeyman could put on this skin which he was in the closet as the psychiatrist, because we know from the ending of the story that he just hid himself as the psychiatrist. So perhaps the raincoat is him disguising himself as a normal New Yorker, or as even as Lester, proving that that he in fact is Lester Billings. But also the fact that the boogeyman appears when Lester re-enters the office, and it says that, quote, he held its Dr. Harper mask in one rotten spade-clawed hand, unquote. And that can kind of signify that not even a professional like Dr. Harper can help Billings. And this was his last try before really going insane. And he doesn't know what to do. And he's a hopeless case. No one can help him, not even a professional like a psychiatrist. But it could also possibly be a symbol of recovery, that he's finally ready to confront the boogeyman, perhaps because the therapy sessions have worked and kind of gave him the courage he needed to confront the boogeyman. But I think there are many reasons to think that the boogeyman is in fact part of Lester Billings himself, because he is a 20-year-old man who was born in 1944, where the husband was the leader of the family and the household, and he decided what did and did not happen. So when Dr. Harper tells Dr. Harper that, quote, sometimes birth control doesn't work, it kind of signifies that he probably didn't want the children by the time Rita got pregnant, but he kind of just had to deal with them. So whenever his anger and stress gets too much, it takes over and decides to kill the children. But then again, his anger towards women is also mentioned in one of the flashbacks, where he describes his mother's overprotectiveness. And it says, quote, when I was a kid, my mom used to take me to the beach and then scream herself hoarse. Don't go out so far, don't go there, it's got an undertow, you only ate an hour ago, don't go over your head, unquote. Because of his childhood, he doesn't want his children to become afraid of the world, and he forces them to sleep in their own rooms when they are ultimately killed by the boogeyman. So he's trying to live up to this expectation of what a good, right man is and what the leader of the family is supposed to do. And you shouldn't curl or be like a curling dad and take way too much care of your children, as that's not healthy for them. And nonetheless, the story is written in the third-person narrative, which makes the story more objective and erases kind of any biases that a first-person narrative could give the reader. And it's easier to make your own interpretation of what the story is than if it was written by Lester Billings or by his narrative. But the themes in the Boogeyman are very similar to the themes of stories like Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde. Because in Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein kind of creates a monster that, like in the Boogeyman, becomes the protagonist's it, and it is kind of a way of extension or an extension of the protagonist's personality, and of separating a character into two, where the bad sides become one person and the good sides become another. But both Frankenstein and Billings act out of trauma, where Frankenstein is so sad about his mother's death that he wants to keep her alive, and Lester acts because of trauma or early memories, as he doesn't want to treat his children like his mother treated him. But then another story is the story of Jekyll and Hyde, where the main character's personality is split, so he's like schizophrenic, and becomes two people, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And like in the Boogeyman and Frankenstein, he creates an alter ego to do the things that are not morally correct. So they are super egoistic, I guess, enough to know what's right and wrong, but they still want to do these morally incorrect things. So they create this it so that their super ego can live alongside the it and still feel morally correct, and blame these things on the boogeyman or Frankenstein's monster. So yeah, that was all I had for today.